Hey, so I've been really looking forward to this series literally for months. So what we're going to do over the next few weeks is we're going to do kind of a character study of the life of David, who is such an interesting, fascinating person. And honestly, a few weeks it's just not enough. But we're going to condense it and kind of truncate it and we're going to make it work, right? So here's what I love about David. Now, you're probably familiar with David if you've been around church for any length of time. Even if not, like the story of David and Goliath in culture, everybody's pretty familiar with that. Well, David is the character from that story. So David is this incredibly complex character, right? Which I love. I appreciate so much people who kind of, you got layers, right? So David was not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination, but what I think is the most important thing about David is that he is referred to as a man after God's own heart. With all of his imperfections, with all of the decisions that he made along the way that he probably wishes that he wouldn't have made, at the end of the day, the thing that matters most about David is he is a man after God's own heart. That is the direction that he chose to set his life towards, is to be a man after God's own heart. Not that I'm going to be perfect, not that I'm going to have, not have missteps along the way, but ultimately that my life is going to be for him, about him, and headed in that direction. And that's what, for me, I appreciate so much about David. And now here's where it kind of gets this is probably preferential. This is, for me personally, I like dudes that are dudes, right? Like, I like the alpha type guys, right? So David was certainly an alpha type dude, but he was also sensitive. So he was this incredible warrior who also then had the ability to communicate and express through song and poem how he felt and what was going on, and kind of help us to understand God in a more full and emotional sense, which I think is helpful. We can talk about our feelings too. That's okay. Wow, I guess not. I thought this was a safe space, but maybe I'm at a different church than I thought I was this morning. So that's kind of what we're going to be going over this series, is looking at David from this perspective. He was a warrior and he was a poet, and his story is such a fascinating story. So this is what's so cool, so helpful about the life of David. Not only do we have, essentially the historical account of what went on in his life, we also have, in many cases, a coinciding poetic explanation of what was going on. So many of the Psalms that David wrote were written about the historical things that took place in his life. For example, like, the David and Goliath thing. There's a psalm that kind of explains how he feels with this. There's a story about his son Absalom and what happened there and how he feels, the story of Bathsheba and what happened there. And we have a psalm, we have poetry that helps us to understand that whole experience. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start kind of at the beginning of David coming onto the scene, like our awareness of David taking place. And so just to give you a little bit of context, if you're not super familiar with the Old Testament, so this is a point in time in the history of Israel where their king was a fellow named Saul. Now, not Saul from the New Testament who became Paul, two different Sauls, so just call the other one. I don't know, seem fitting. Thank you, appreciate that. I tried. So Saul, this is what's funny, kind of fascinating about the whole, ultimately what led them into the situation that they found themselves in, is that it was never really God's plan for them to have a king. God's plan was that he would be their God and they would be his people, and that he would lead them and ultimately kind of show them, what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to go, and he would provide for them. But they kind of started looking around at all the other nations, and they're like, well, everybody else has a king, so why can't we have a king like everybody else has a king? And so God gave them what they thought that they wanted. And what's funny, it's such a parallel to our lives, right? How many times do we want what we want? We're not as interested in what God wants, but we want what we want, and so we ask God to give us what we want, and he gives us what we want, and we finally realize through that what we want is not what we actually need. And God is more interested in giving us what we need. Maybe a better approach is trying to align what we want with what God wants, rather than trying to get God to align with what we want, right? So just something to think about. So David's coming onto the scene. And Saul is the king. Saul has not been a very good king, and God has at this point decided that it's time for somebody else to take over. So we're going to pick up our story, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Now, here's the deal. We're going to read a lot of scripture today, and I don't apologize for that, but I want you to know that we're going to pause and stop along the way. We're going to take restroom breaks, right? Like, not really, but like we're on a road trip. We're not just going to go all the way through. We're going to stop along the way and stretch our legs and make sense of everything. Everybody good with that? Okay, here we go. It says, now the Lord said to Samuel, Samuel was the prophet, or was a prophet, and was ultimately, so again, understanding everything, right? So they had a king, but they were also led by spiritual leaders. Samuel was one of those spiritual leaders. And so the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I think that's an important point to stop on. So the oil that Samuel would take to David was representative of the Spirit of God. It was symbolic, right? And so what would happen is when Samuel found the person that would be the next king, he would take this horn, which is a vessel that they would use to put the oil in, and he would pour it over that person. And as the oil ran down the guy's body, the person's body, it was symbolic of God's Spirit kind of coming over and taking over that person's body, and that they would be anointed to do the thing that God had called them to do. So that's what the oil is and the significance of the oil. And so then it says, I will send you to Jesse, the Bethlehemite. I really struggle with that word, Bethlehemite. You understand what I'm saying. For I have selected a king for myself among his sons. So God tells Samuel, go to Jesse. He's in Bethlehem, and one of his kids will be the next king. But Samuel said, how can I go? When Saul hears of it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, a cow. I always feel like it's important to clarify at that point, because I know some of y'all are immature, right? I am too sometimes, right? We got to stop. Let's move. So take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Now, the reason that Samuel was concerned is because he was going to select the next king while the current king was still in power, which would probably cause some problems if the current king found out that you're finding a replacement for him. And so this is what he said, you shall invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you. So Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem. What I love about the response to that is God's like, here's the plan, here's the steps, here's what you're supposed to do. I see you have some concerns. This is how you mitigate those concerns. And in Samuel's response was, he did what the Lord said. Isn't that cool? Like, just listen and obey, right? And then it says, the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, do you come in peace? He said, in peace, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. It was a very ceremonial thing, so there were some steps that needed to be taken to prepare themselves for this. So he also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So let's get some more information here. Jesse is David's father. Jesse has 8 sons. Everybody remember that. Everybody say 8 sons. Jesse has 8 sons. So this is what happens. Jesse brings all of his 7 sons, not his 8 sons, brings 7 of his sons into this little shindig, this meeting. Samuel goes into it knowing that he's going to select one of Jesse's sons as the next king of Israel. So when they get there, when Samuel gets there, it says this. When they entered, he looked at Eliab, who was the firstborn, and he thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. So Samuel thought, man, that was easy. Like, I showed up, first dude I saw, that's got to be the guy. And this is what God said to Samuel. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So Samuel's like, well, that's disappointing. I'm sure, like, he thought that was a quick trip, go home, probably get home in time to watch my show, right? Not that they didn't have Netflix back then, right? And so then Jesse called Abinadab, so that would be the second in line, and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. So we're like, too deep. And so let's keep going. The next Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. How many sons did Jesse have? 8. Okay, so Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. So I'm sure Samuel's a little confused at this point. He's like, God, I know that you told me that one of Jesse's sons would be chosen. I've gone through this whole process with all of the ones that have been presented to me, and none of them are it. So then Samuel says to Jesse, they're like, is this all the kids you got? This is the modern translation of it, right? And so Samuel said to Jesse, are these all the children? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending sheep. I'm curious here if if Jesse was maybe protecting David, or if Jesse was like underestimating David. I don't know what the answer to that question is. But, that was his baby. That was the youngest. So it could be that he was like, well, I wouldn't want anything to happen to him, so I'm not even going to bring him in. Or it could be like, he's the youngest. Like, he probably doesn't even know how to tie his shoes. I'm not going to bring him in. I don't know what the answer to that question is. It's just something to think about. How about that? So Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. So he sent and brought them in. And so this is where David comes onto the scene. It says, now he was ruddy. And that's a word that we don't use. So ruddy is it's like a reddish, healthy tint. And I'm like, I like that because I kind of got a reddish, healthy tint. Well, it's reddish anyway. So he was ruddy with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him. So he would pour the oil on him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah. So here's what's crazy. This is what's wild. David has this experience, right? Where Samuel, the most well-known, probably famous prophet in all of the land of Israel, comes to his house, passes over all of his sons, chooses him to be the next king of Israel, pours oil all over his head, and then just leaves. And David is left there in his house with all of his brothers. Like, his life in that very moment doesn't change all that drastically, although it changes entirely. Does that make sense? Like, his circumstances don't change, but his purpose is completely different from that point forward. And so that's such an amazing passage of Scripture with so many things that we could spend time on. But what I've done today is I have narrowed it down to 3. You are welcome, right? Okay, we can work through it line by line then. We're going to be here all night. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to look at what I believe are 3 principles from this passage that are obviously significant to this story, but also they apply to our lives as well. And what's so good about principles, what's so important about principles is that they transcend, right? If they mattered then, if they worked then, they matter now, and they work now. So the first principle, the title for today's message, just in case you're taking notes, is the oil of kings, because, David got oil poured all over him as he became the king. But our first principle is this: God will provide. God will provide. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, it says, fill your horn with oil and go, for I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons. God said, I have selected a king for myself from among his sons. One version says, I have provided a king for myself. And you know what I think the principle in that is that as God sends Samuel to do this thing, as David is part of this thing, that they're all just part of the thing. Like, it's God's plan. God is the one who provides. God is the one who makes a way. We've just got to listen and obey, right? And I think what we find in this story is that Samuel, God was reminding Samuel that, hey, you don't have to try and figure this all out on your own. You don't have to have all of the answers. You don't have to know all of the details. I just need you to go the direction that I've told you to go and do the thing that I've told you to do. And as you do that, as you trust me, as you listen to me, I will make a way, because I'm the one that is going to provide for the thing. It's like this. Like, God is not going to ask you to do something and not give you the necessary tools to do the thing that he's asked you to do. If he asked you to do it, this is that old church saying, like, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. And it's so cheesy, but man, it's so true. Like, God will ask you to do the thing, but he will provide the tools necessary along the way to help you to do the thing that he doesn't ask you to do. Bad grammar, good preaching, right? So I think that that's a lesson, that's a principle that we could all learn from. I know that I'm still trying to figure this one out, that it's God who provides. It's not all on me. It's not all on how hard I work or how hard I try or how much energy I put into it or how smart I think I am or how clever I think I am. I don't have to have all of the answers. Sometimes I just have to remember that it is God who provides, that he is the one that's responsible, that I need to listen to him a little bit more and stop trying to come up with my own answers. I was Shelly and I were at a conference last week. Anybody familiar with Kirk Cousins, quarterback, NFL? He was there, and man, like I respected the dude, but like last week I was like, next level, such a smart guy. Now, here's what's cool. He was actually, it's interesting correlation to the story. He was selected number 8 in the NFL draft that year. Number 8, the 8th quarterback taken in the draft. And the day before the draft, his dad called him and told him about the story of David, who was the 8th son. It was such a fascinating thing. But one of the things that came up in that conversation was how God is a chatterbox. The problem is we're the ones we're not listening. It's not that God's not talking. It's just that we're so distracted that we can't hear what he's got to say. And you know what? Like, we're so quick, because I'm church people too. I know how church people work. Like, we like to blame other people for our problems. It's kind of what we do. And so in this particular case, we're like, well, God's just not talking. My question is, like, are you listening? Or are you just fast-paced, furious, got the music cranked on 10, like every volume all the way up and just... And, of course, you're not going to hear if you've got all that stuff going on. And so the idea here is just to remember that God will provide. Let's lean into that. Let's not try to figure it all out. It worked out pretty good for Samuel. Worked out pretty good for David. And I suspect it'll work out pretty well for us if we will do what we are supposed to do, right? All right, so that's the first principle. The second principle is this. And this is kind of like maybe it's a modern explanation of a timeless principle, and it's that God isn't impressed by clicks. That would be, because we're all, how many of you get frustrated like with clickbait and like articles? This is one of my big frustrations in life. Like, I love reading articles. Shelly gives me a hard time because I like Facebook because I like words. And she likes Instagram because she likes pictures, And so I like to read information and get try to know as much as I possibly can about as many things as possible so that I then actually know nothing. This is what it amounts to, right? But one of my great frustrations in life is when I see an article or a YouTube video or something that the title is, it's like, yes, I need this in my life right now. This is information that I must have, and then you click it and it is not. What you got clickbaited, right? And so God is not interested in clicks. Let me explain what I'm talking about. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, it says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Now, this is probably one of the most well-known verses about David in general, but certainly, kind of to this specific time period. God reminds Samuel, while he's in this process of selecting the king, that he's not as interested in the same things that everybody else is interested in. He's not as concerned with what everybody else's opinion of the thing is or what they think that he should do. Like, he's interested in his plan, his purpose, and seeing that come to fruition. And I kind of think about, like, the way this plays out. Maybe for us, maybe for if you're a parent, like, and as kids, you've heard this from your parents, just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean you should do it, right? Just because everybody else is jumping off a bridge doesn't mean that you, and I'm like, that actually sounds kind of fun, I mean, depends on what's at the bottom of the bridge. Let's make sure. And so God is reminding Samuel that, hey, I'm not interested in what everybody else is interested in. Look, I understand that a lot of times people will look at something, the appearance, and have some assumptions and think that this is what they're supposed to do. I just want you to know that I see things differently. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. They're higher, so maybe you should trust me and not trust yourself. And in fact, this is kind of what got them into the mess that they were in the first place. So they selected Saul, like we talked about before, because they looked around at all the other nations, and all the other nations had a king, so they're like, well, we kind of want to be like everybody else. And you know what's funny is, like, we're not really called to be like everybody else. We're called to be who we are, right? Individually, unique. Like, you have a very specific call on your life. And so maybe the best thing to do is not to look around, not to look horizontal, but to look vertical and start to get your directives from there, maybe. And so we can learn from the nation of Israel that, hey, maybe you aren't supposed to look around. You're not supposed to be like everybody else. Like, I've called you out. You're supposed to be different. And then beyond that, they selected Saul as the king almost exclusively because he was about a head taller than everybody else. It's like, he's tall. He could probably lead us. That'll be fine. That'll work. That seems like a great idea. Doesn't matter, what's actually in the head that's above everybody else. Doesn't matter what's in the heart. Doesn't matter if he has any character. Does anybody play basketball? Anybody enjoy playing basketball? It's fun. It's a great sport. It's really irritating, but it's fun. So what's happened to me at times past, I like basketball, but I'm not very good at basketball. It's just one of those things, right? Anybody else resonate? You feel it? Good. So what's happened is we used to play a lot of pickup basketball. Now, the thing about pickup basketball is like you're picking up people you don't know. Like you don't know what they can do. You have no idea if they're any good. Unfortunately, with basketball, you make a lot of assumptions. Like if you're tall. Like you gotta be good, useful, helpful if you're tall, and that's not always the case. There have been a couple of times where you pick up a tall guy, and if the tall guy is not dribbling and shooting before the game, there's usually a reason why. It's because they can't shoot or dribble. They're tall and they can jump maybe. There was one time there was a guy, like he was dunking before the game. I'm like, oh yeah, first pick, for sure. And then we start playing, like brother can't shoot, brother can't dribble. He's just tall and can dunk because he's tall. Like that's not, at least I'm consistent. I'm bad in warm-ups and in the game, right? Like there's no delineation between the two. And Saul kind of is selected based on the fact that he's, a head above, and he was lacking in what actually matters. And I think that's what's so important for us to remember. This may be as important for us today, maybe even more important for us today, as it was the day that it was. God's like, hey, I'm not looking at what you're looking at. I'm not interested in what you're into. I understand that the attention of society is on this. I understand that the attention of culture is on this. I'm interested in different things. And I think that if we listen to that, if we follow that, we understand that God is not interested in appearances. He's not interested in impressing people. He's not interested in us getting attention. He's not interested in the clicks. He's interested in us loving him. He's interested in us living for him. And he's interested in us loving each other and living for each other. That's what God is interested in. All of these inward things, not necessarily the outward things that we tend to focus on collectively. Not so much us, but, us. Is that helpful? So that's the second principle. Is that just remember, God is not impressed by the things maybe that we tend to fall for as society. The last principle is this, and we're going to call this the last right thing. The last right thing. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 11, and it says, and Samuel said to Jesse, are these all the children? So Samuel thought that he had seen all of Jesse's kids, but there were only 7. And so then Jesse says to Samuel, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending the sheep. So all of the older kids come in, and they kind of go through this process. But all the while, David's out there hanging out with sheep. I've heard that sheep are kind of like low IQ. They're kind of dumb. I don't know how you test the IQ of a sheep. Again, all of this is based on what you hear. Like but they seem so fun, right? So David is out there with a bunch of dumb sheep, probably having a good time, probably frolicking around like sheep would do. I don't know what they would do. And what you find in this moment, this is what I think, here's the principle for us. David was doing the last right thing. The last responsibility that he was given, the last task that he was given, the thing that he was responsible for was to go and take care of the sheep. And David was out doing the last right thing while all of his brothers were coming in like sticking your chest out, look at me, Samuel. And David's just out there doing the last right thing. And so here's what I think about for church people. Boy, that's a message for us. Because this is what church people do. And I can make fun of church people because I'm church people, right? Like you can make fun of your family, but nobody else can make fun of your family. It's the same thing. So I'm going to make fun of church people for just a minute. This is what church people do. Church people, we don't keep doing the last right thing. We stop doing everything while we're waiting on God to give us the next thing. That's kind of the way we're like, oh, well, I'm just waiting on God in this season of my life. So while I'm waiting on God, I'm not going to do anything because I don't want to miss, God, as if he couldn't get our attention while we were doing something else. And so maybe a better approach would be to continue to be faithful to the last thing that you were entrusted to and responsible for while you're waiting on the next thing. Doesn't it seem to make more sense that, because this is what happens. Can we just be reminded? You were very excited about the thing that you're doing currently at some point. That was the next thing at some point, and you knew that God had called you to that at some point. So why would God give you more when you're not being faithful with less? Why would God give you another opportunity? Why would God promote you when you're not taking seriously the position that you're in currently? Why would God give you more if you're not good stewards of less? Why would God give you a new thing if you're not faithful with the current thing? So, keep doing the last right thing. And I think that's a principle that we can learn from David. So, this is where we're at. I believe that these principles, essentially, they formed and forged the life of David. They helped him to become the person that he became. Ultimately, one of the components of that was to become this great warrior and great leader. But let's not forget about the poetry, right? We got a warrior poet, not just a warrior. So here's what's cool. If you look at Psalm 139, many scholars believe that Psalm 139 was written kind of as a coinciding explanation of what was going on during this time. It helps us to get some insight into where David's mind was while all this was taking place. So our next point, you got to bear with me. I titled it New King's Bars. I grew up in the 90s. So I suspect that if David was a rapper coming out, like his name could have been New King or New Kings, because you got to put a Z on there instead of an S. We had that, and then obviously the NU for new, clearly, right? We had this I don't know, the thing that we did in marketing where we changed every S to a Z, and then like it transitioned to the next decade where we took out all the vowels. You remember that? Yeah. So New King's Bars. Let's talk about David's poetry. He's the new king, and these are his bars. I had way much more fun with that than you guys did. I thought maybe y'all would go with me on that ridiculous trip, but you didn't. So, Psalm 139, verses 1 through 4. So what we're going to do, we've picked some of the highlights here. And again, just consider the context. Consider what David's going through. Consider kind of the experience that he had just gone through. And I think it gives you a fuller understanding of that moment. It says this, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise." Now, thinking about what he had just gone through, where God's like, hey, I'm not interested in the appearance. I'm interested in your heart. And David's like, search my heart and know that thing. When I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. And so what I think you find in this is like David's recognition that God is looking at his heart, and David's response to that is like, make sure my heart is where my heart needs to be because I know you're looking at my heart. And in verse 7 through 10, so Psalm 139, verses 7 through 10, it says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. Here's what I think is so interesting about that. So again, considering the situation and what had just happened, David's like, man, I was out in the fields tending sheep. And the last thing on my mind had to be becoming the next king of Israel. And yet, even though I'm just out here by myself doing my thing, I cannot get away from your plan. I cannot get away from your purpose. I cannot get away from the calling that you have for my life. So he said, if I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, which, what a beautiful way to express that, right? That's the poetry that we're talking about. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. Psalm 139, verses 13 through 14, it says this, you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So as and we're very familiar with that. That was a pretty popular verse of Scripture. But when you start to consider the context, you start to consider that David had just had this experience with God, right? And he sees kind of full circle the goodness of God and the fact that God is actively working in his life. And if you're anything like me, sometimes you look at your life and you're just like, I don't understand why God would choose to use us, but he does. And I am fully surrendered to that. I am so thankful that he does. I am fearfully and wonderfully made, not deserving, but understanding that he gives it to us anyway, many times in spite of us. And so David kind of responds to that. It's like, this is obviously all you're doing, and I am so thankful for that. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. And then the last one, this is actually the last two verses of Psalm 139. It says, search me, God, and know my heart. What he starts with at the beginning of Psalm 139 is essentially what he finishes with at the end of Psalm 139, and it's to, God, search my heart. I want more than anything else in my life. This marked the journey of David. He was a man after God's own heart because he constantly opened his heart to be examined by God. That would be worth writing down and maybe thinking about and stewing over for a little bit, right? He became a man after God's own heart because he constantly allowed his heart to be searched and tested by God to make sure that it was what it needed to be and where it needed to be. So it says, test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's anything offensive, see if there's any offensive way in me. And then he finishes. This is the very last line in Psalm 139. And I believe that if it's not the most important prayer that David ever prayed, it's got to be in the top 5. This is how he finishes Psalm 139. And lead me in the way everlasting. Lead me. God, I see that in this moment that you have a plan, that you have a purpose. I am submitting to that. It scares me. I don't know exactly what that brings and what that will create. I understand that this is going to be, this is going to make me a very powerful person, a very important person. And what I want is to not do what I want. What I want is to do what you want me to do. I want you to lead me in the way everlasting. And so his prayer is that God will set the direction of his life towards him. That God will help him to maintain the posture of his heart so that it is directed towards God. And that is what ultimately allowed David to become this warrior poet. And you know what I think? I think that as David went through all of his life, the ups and downs, because he certainly had them. I mean, I think what happens is we forget the bad and we think about only the good of some of these people. But man, talk about struggles. This dude had some struggles, right? And so what I think with David is that he was always able to go back to that moment where Samuel was pouring oil on his head and the oil was running down his face and down his shoulders and down his chest, and recognizing that in that moment that God had called him, that recognizing in that moment that God had a plan for his life, that God had purpose for him, that God had something for him to do with his life, and that he could always reflect back on that moment, even if what was happening currently didn't seem like it was in line with what God had called him to, that he could always go back to that moment and understand and say that I have been called, I have been equipped, I have a purpose and a destiny for my life. And it helps him to kind of stay on the way everlasting path. Does that make sense? It's like, let me make this very, very real for us. It's like I could go back to a moment in my life where I know for a fact that God has called me. Like I have an experience with God. And you know what's so important and powerful about having an experience with God is that once you have an experience with God, you are never at the mercy of arguments of other people. Ever. Ever. It's so fascinating that a person who's experienced God is less concerned with the opinions of other people about what God can do in somebody's life. Because, bro, I understand you got your thoughts, but I've felt it, I've seen it, I've experienced it. I don't have to wonder and question what your thoughts and opinions are, right? And so for us, when we have that experience, when we have that moment, when symbolically the oil is poured over our heads and we have been anointed for the life and the path that God has called us to, when we do that, we can always go back to that moment. Even if what I'm going through right now doesn't seem like what God has called me to, I can always go back to that moment and remember that experience marked me for the rest of my life. It changed me. I'm different. And now because of that, regardless of what I'm going through now, I'm going to set my path towards the way everlasting. And that's what, man, if you get nothing else out of this information today, I pray that we, like David, pray that prayer. that God would set our hearts towards the way everlasting, that we would fix our eyes on him, that we would run towards him, that the trajectory of our hearts would be towards him. Not that we're going to be perfect, not that we're not going to make mistakes, but the direction of our life is towards him. And that's what I pray for us today. So there's two things that have to happen for that to take place. One, you have to have already had an experience that you can lean back on. Or two, you need an experience that you can look back on that's kind of the catalyst for that path and journey for you. So here's my prayer for us. This is what I pray. I pray that if you've had one of those experiences with God, that he would just make it like just the clarity around it, that he had called you, that he had created you for purpose, that you have value not because of what you do, but because of who you are, that you belong to him, that he created you. Like all of the things that I think we intuitively know, that we would understand those things more fully. And then secondly, if you're here and you've never had one of those experiences with God, today's a heck of a day to have one of those experiences with God. Like no better day, no better time than right now to have one of those experiences with God where you are anointed with oil, the King's oil, and God is symbolically pouring it on your head and down your shoulders, and it is a moment that you can look back on and say, that's the time, that's the moment, that's the day that I had an experience with God, and my life will never, ever be the same. Let me pray for us. Jesus, thank you so much. God, thank you for clarity about who you are and what you came to do. God, that you came to save and to rescue and to call and to equip. God, you came to prepare our hearts for the plan and the path that God has for us. I pray, Jesus, today, that if we've had one of those moments or experiences with you where you touched our hearts and you changed our lives and you changed the way that we see everything in front of us, that we have become a new creation. God, I pray that we'll always be able to remember that moment with clarity, how we felt, what you did in our hearts, and we'll know that that's the day and that's the way that our hearts were set towards the way everlasting. But God, I also know that we're all at different stages and places in our life, and if there's anyone here today that has not had that moment, that has not had that experience, God, I pray that today that you would show yourself to them, that you would show them who you are, the love and care and concern that you have for them, and that you have a plan and a purpose for their life, that you are calling them today to yourself. And like we talked about earlier, God, we're not going to rush through this because we do believe that you speak. We just have to stop and listen sometimes. So God, for just the next 30 seconds, I pray that you would speak to every heart that needs to hear from you today. God, I pray that we're never the same. I pray that we're always able to look back on days like today and to know that what you've spoken to our hearts, what you've shown us about ourselves and yourself, God, it will mark the beginning of our journey towards you for the rest of our lives. Jesus, we love you. We're so thankful for you. God, as we leave this place, let our lives be different. Let us be changed. And I pray, God, that above all, that you are honored and glorified in the way that we live. And it's in Jesus' incredible name.